The stories. Why this librarian reopened a cold map drawer. In late September of 2014, the Quiet Town Library off Route 47 got a new head librarian named Corinne Ashland. She was 39, a former archivist who'd spent years cataloging geological surveys for a state university. By all accounts, Corinne wasn't the kind of person to chase ghosts until the day she decided to reopen an old, locked map drawer that everyone else had forgotten. The drawer sat in the basement stacks, labeled Time State Topography 1952 to 1958 asterisk. Its brass handle had gone dull with age, and the key was missing. For years, staff used the cabinet as a makeshift table for coffee mugs and boxes of donations. But one morning, while rearranging a shipment of donated atlases, Corinne noticed a faint rust-colored smear near the label. It looked like dried clay or maybe iron dust. Either way, it didn't belong there. She mentioned it to her assistant, and he laughed, saying, "That drawer's cursed. Ask Mrs. Langley. She swears a surveyor disappeared working on those maps." Corinne smiled politely, but something in her stayed hooked on the idea. She asked around. The drawer dated back to when the building served as a records annex for the county planning office. In the mid-50s, several regional floodplain studies were stored there before the files were relocated or supposedly relocated to the state archives. No one ever verified that. When Corinne checked the archive's digital inventory, she found gaps. 4 missing surveys, all from the same year, 1957. They covered a stretch of riverland that was later condemned for a hydroelectric project that never materialized. That evening, Corinne used a universal key set kept for restoration work and opened the map drawer for the first time in decades. Inside were rolled parchments bound with cotton strings, their edges yellowed. Beneath them, she found a tin box wrapped in wax paper. Inside the box lay a water-stained notebook, a compass with a cracked lens, and a faded photograph of 2 men standing beside a field the size of a football stadium, ringed by survey poles. On the back of the photo, someone had written, asterisk, last day before the dig, GM asterisk. Corinne scanned the initials against old employment rosters. There was a Gregory Mallon, a field engineer who'd gone missing in June of 1958. Officially, he'd left the project for family reasons, but the local paper from that summer told a stranger story. Asterisk, surveyor vanishes near proposed reservoir site. Search suspended after 3 days. Asterisk, no follow-up, no body recovered. Corinne started a file. 1. She called the county records department. A man named Leland Cross, an aging clerk who'd worked there since the 70s, remembered something. Mahlon. Yeah? He was working on the Franklin Bend plan. Whole thing got shelved when the funding dried up. I heard his partner quit soon after. Leland didn't recall the partner's name, but he mentioned an old storage trailer the county once kept near the riverbank. They hauled the trailer out after a flood in the 60s, he said. If anything survived, it's in the historical depot now. The depot was just a few miles away. Corinne drove there that weekend, signed in as a researcher, and requested the Franklin Bend materials. The clerk brought her a warped cardboard box smelling of mildew. Inside were soil samples, invoices, and a reel of magnetic tape marked Audio Log 4 field notes. She had to borrow an old player from the depot staff. The recording was faint, but clear enough to recognize 2 male voices. Asterisk, Greg, you're not logging this, right? Asterisk. Asterisk. Relax. It's just us. But if this ridge keeps sinking, we need to report it. Asterisk. Relax. Relax. Asterisk. Asterisk. We will. After the last survey, the company can't afford another delay. Asterisk. The tape ended with wind noise and a scrape, like a microphone hitting dirt. Corinne replayed it 3 times, listening for landmarks. At one point, one of them mentioned mile marker 12 and the culvert by the sycamores. Using digitized topographic maps, she traced those features to a narrow bend along the river, now fenced off as private land. When she brought this to the local sheriff's office, the deputy shrugged. If you're talking about Mahlan, that case is older than my dad. We can't go digging around on private property for a rumor. But Corinne wasn't chasing rumor. She was following evidence. She emailed a geologist friend from her university days, Dr. Theo Ricks, who specialized in landslide patterns. Theo ran a ground-penetrating radar survey along that same bend under a research permit for soil erosion. The data showed a deep subsidence pocket about 20 feet from the current riverline, consistent with an old collapsed tunnel. Theo sent her the printout and a note, asterisk, you might have just found their camp trench. Asterisk. They returned together a week later. Theo handled the radar equipment while Corinne recorded the coordinates. Near sunset, a small piece of metal surfaced from the silt, a corroded survey tripod leg, stamped Property of Franklin Bend Hydro Limited. The find was modest, but it confirmed the crew had worked exactly where she predicted. From that point, Corinne began piecing the timeline. The notebook from the tin box mentioned sudden soil shifts, pressure readings, and the phrase asterisk, map variance, river shift, not natural. Asterisk. The handwriting was Mahlan's, matching samples from his earlier reports. It appeared he suspected someone had deliberately diverted a drainage channel to falsify flood risk data, possibly to inflate land value before government acquisition. If true, exposing it could have derailed the whole project. The company had millions at stake. Mahlan filed his last note 2 days before he vanished. Corinne cross-checked the company records and found the corporation dissolved in 1961, right after a quiet lawsuit settlement with an undisclosed party. No public record linked it to Mahlan. But tucked inside the notebook's back cover, hidden beneath the lining, she found a short letter addressed to M.R. Hanley, attorney at law. It never got mailed. The ink was blurred but readable enough. Asterisk, they moved the stakes. If anything happens, check the revised map in drawer C. It's the only truth left. Asterisk. Drawer C was the one she'd opened. By early winter, local journalists picked up her findings. The county authorized a limited excavation, mainly to verify the historic maps. When workers dug near the subsidence pocket, they uncovered remnants of an old metal barrel containing drafting tools and fragments of canvas. Among them was a wristwatch, glass shattered, still faintly engraved, asterisk GM, asterisk dental fragments. Nearby, later confirmed Mahlan's identity. The discovery didn't just solve a missing person case, it revealed a quiet cover-up. The original floodplain data, preserved in those maps, showed the river was unstable long before developers planned the reservoir. Ignoring it had likely saved the investors short-term losses, but cost one man his life. The county issued a formal acknowledgement of error, though no one alive faced charges. The land was later rezoned as a conservation area. Corinne kept working at the library, though people now came from all over asking about the librarian who solved the map mystery. She never took credit beyond saying she just followed what was left behind. The old drawer was cleaned, cataloged, and displayed behind glass with the tin box and the compass inside. Every so often, she'd unlock the case to polish the brass handle, and she'd think about Mahlan's note the way he wrote times the only truth left, asterisk. She understood now that archives aren't just about paper or ink, they're about the things people try to bury, and the few who still choose to look. By the next spring, the library basement smelled of fresh paint. The drawer sat quietly in its corner, again, cool metal against the hum of fluorescent lights. And that was enough. No headlines, no dramatics, just a reminder that sometimes reopening the past isn't about curiosity. It's about letting someone finally be found. The vanished miner of Nome Ridge. In early summer of 2019, a seasonal miner booked a bunk in Nome and walked the ridgeline above town alone. He carried a used metal detector, a battered pack, and a claim map folded into quarters inside a plastic sleeve. Several weeks later, searchers traced his tracks to wined, scraped gravel and a shallow cut marked by recent shovel bites. Locals reportedly still point to that slope when the north breeze lines the tundra grass and the sea turns gray. His name was Daniel Kerr. 48. A heavy equipment operator from Fairbanks who prospected small leases during seasonal breaks and layoffs. Archived notes kept by a borough clerk say he told the front desk he wanted 3 quiet weeks near Anvil Creek. He paid cash for a room 2 blocks from Front Street and asked for a ground floor unit facing the alley. The clerk wrote that he spoke calmly, carried no visible weapon, and wore rubber boots with dried clay seams. State records show Kerr renewed a limited entry claim the previous winter and mailed 2 small payments from a post office kiosk. The county file from 2009 includes a faded survey of the same bench, annotated with pencil arrows around a shallow tributary bend. Some locals claimed an older prospector had washed flakes there after a flood rearranged bars along the creek mouth. Investigators never confirmed whether Kerr knew those stories, though a library sign-out shows he borrowed 2 regional mining guides. On a Tuesday, dispatch logs recorded a weather advisory for dense coastal cloud and intermittent drizzle, with ceiling low and visibility variable. A taxi receipt in his room lists a drop at the Dome Creek pullout just before noon, with gear loaded in careful stages. A store owner later told troopers he sold Kerr fuel mix, replacement hose, and a handheld radio that could scan aviation traffic. None of those items were recovered at the site where his footprints ended among scattered cobbles and straw-colored sedge. The first person to sound an alarm was Lena White, 36, a clerk who managed checkouts and kept the lodge keyboard. She reportedly noticed his key still hanging late Thursday, then again Friday morning, with bedsheets unwrinkled and towels folded inside the rack. Her archived notes mention 2 missed conversations about a package and a quiet guest who nodded often but avoided long exchanges. She called the non-emergency line and asked whether a welfare check made sense, then waited while staff inspected the empty room. Deputy Mark Oden, 41, flew in from Kotzebue to assist troopers with a grid search once a formal report was filed. He interviewed White, the taxi driver, and a maintenance worker who remembered helping Kerr carry a small pump to the curb. Oden later described the man as methodical and polite, with a list on notebook paper and a preference for working alone. He also noted conflicting accounts of departure time and load weight, details which investigators never reconciled despite repeated calls and follow-up visits. A team walked the ridge north of town and found shovel marks, a cleared path through dwarf willow, and boot prints with broad, shallow tread. The prints crossed a frost scar, skirted a hollow with pooled meltwater, and paused near a rust-stained boulder shaped like a wedge. A torn glove finger lay beside small pebbles sorted into a checkered sample tray, arranged as if awaiting a short return. Beyond that point, the ground turned hard, mixed with stones polished by freeze and thaw, and the pattern thinned into scuffs. Searchers followed a faint line downslope where wind had planed the surface smooth and left only darker grit between sparse lichens. A wide arc of boot marks then reappeared beside a patched tarp weighted with rocks, with cup rings and a foil packet lying nearby. Troopers collected the items and photographed a shallow trench with damp sides that suggested recent work before weather closed again. Investigators never confirmed whether the trench held any payable material, since it had partly slumped and pooled under the light rain. Reports from that week document 3 helicopter passes and 2 dog teams that worked in widening circles along gullies cut by melt streams. One handler mentioned scented trace near an abandoned culvert where snow lingered beneath brush despite warm air and steady coastal light. Another handler disagreed and wrote that the dogs were reacting to old human routes left by hikers and berry pickers in previous seasons. Records conflict over how long the team stayed in the highest zone, since fog reportedly rolled over the ridge each afternoon. Back in town, Oden checked cameras along Front Street and a service station where Kerr had bought coffee and fuel in a plastic can. Footage shows him scanning a folded map, speaking briefly with a fisherman, and noting something on a receipt before stepping into the parking lot. The fisherman later recalled a curious question about river levels and an interest in outflow timing when coastal winds pushed against freshwater. Investigators never confirmed whether that conversation influenced Kerr's route choice, though the creek mouth was not part of the official grid. A second search concentrated on drainage cuts south of the ridge where meltwater gathered in shallow slots that deepened toward muskeg and scattered pools. Volunteer notes describe thin ice inside shaded pockets, boot sinking to ankle depth, and a rhythmic clink from stones shifting underfoot. One volunteer reportedly found a strip of duct tape with a partial thumbprint that matched nothing in available files. Another found a snack wrapper that matched lodge vending stock, though state records say the batch code was common in several towns. As days passed, a working theory formed that Kerr may have backtracked unseen and taken a lower traverse when fog reduced visibility. That idea fit with the arc-shaped prints and the trench location, as if he wanted to reach his tarp without climbing again. It did not explain the missing pump, the radio, or the hose, which should have been bulky enough to impede movement. Investigators never confirmed whether a second cache existed farther down the slope, despite repeated sweeps and systematic probing of shallow depressions. A guide who knew the hill said a snow machine trail sometimes hardened into a deceptive ribbon that drew walkers toward an older cut. Some locals claimed that cut ended abruptly at a short headwall where loose gravel slid under light steps and carried people sideways. The guide's statement appears in archived notes, along with a sketch of the headwall and an arrow pointing toward a low bench. Records conflict on whether that bench was searched with poles or only scanned from above while fog drifted through the notch. Dispatch logs capture a week of calls from relatives and coworkers who described Kerr as steady, frugal, and rarely prone to risk. A union steward from Fairbanks said he never drank on shift and disliked crowds, preferring quiet cabins where he could read old manuals. A former foreman reportedly remembered a habit of marking bolts with lacquer to track vibration and a pocket notebook filled with measurements. None of those details offered a clear reason for a wrong step, a sudden detour, or a decision to leave equipment behind. During a final sweep, searchers found a shallow imprint shaped like a knee beside a tangle of willow pulled up by the roots. A few inches away, a smear of damp soil crossed a rock face and ended in grains pressed into a pattern like fabric. Photographs show no blood and no obvious shoe print, only disturbed grit and a thread that matched the torn glove finger. Investigators never confirmed whether the marks indicated a stumble, since wind picked up overnight and sanded the surface into a uniform crust. In late summer, the case file grew thin as weather improved and seasonal crews rotated home, leaving notes and maps in labeled folders. A short memorandum proposes that Kerr intended to sample at 3 points along a side channel where the creek bent around a low rise. Another memorandum argues he likely aimed for the mouth to watch conditions during a falling tide that could concentrate heavier grains near cobble bars. Records conflict on estimated timeframes, since the taxi drop was imprecise and cloud patterns disrupted any meaningful shadow analysis. White kept a copy of the missing poster taped near the keyboard and wrote dates beside calls that asked the same questions. She reportedly told a visiting brother that the room stayed quiet for weeks, though the alley sometimes carried diesel scent after midnight. Her notebook ends with a line about returning a deposit and boxing 3 shirts for storage behind the desk with other unclaimed items. Investigators never confirmed whether a family member retrieved the box, since shipping records list only a surname and illegible initials. In autumn, a hunter spotted a rectangle of blue fabric near frost, stunted spruce, and radioed coordinates before weather closed again over the hills. A team hiked the bearing and found only a faded tarp shard, a snapped grommet, and marks from fox tracks in soft ground. The shard color matched nothing cataloged in evidence, and the grommet style differed from the tarp photographed at the trench site. State records list that lead as inconclusive and recommend renewed searches when spring snow recedes and the ground unlocks along the gullies. Years later, the ridge still draws walkers on long evenings when the light stretches and the sea reflects a dull metallic band. Some locals claimed the miner's cache lies near an old drift where meltwater vanishes into gravel and reappears below a low natural sill. Others point toward the head wall and say the bench gave way in thaw, swallowing a footprint and smoothing everything into wind-polished stone. Investigators never confirmed any of those theories, and the county file from 2009 remains a caution about incomplete ground. The story ends without resolution beyond the paper trail, a set of maps, and careful handwriting that measured days and minor purchases. Dispatch logs, state records, and archive notes describe a quiet man who planned small tasks and walked uphill before fog settled again. The ridge faces the sea and the town lights, and its gravel shifts each season when freeze and thaw pull stones apart. Kerr's name remains on a page that lodges between tabs, and the ridge keeps its distances when the wind crosses gently. The stories. These archived tapes were a warning at the lake. The county kept a box of old tapes that nobody requested, though people mentioned a lake in half the labels. Each reel carried a handwritten date in faded ink, spanning from 1984 through 2001, then stopping abruptly. Rena Valdez was 34, a county records technician who covered the public window and handled the backroom shelves. She had planned a quick shift, then a quiet drive to her sister's apartment for leftover stew and television. The box of tapes ruined that plan because the new intern stacked it crookedly, and the lid slid open suddenly. One cardboard sleeve read Lake Patrol. Another said Ranger Tower 2. The thickest sleeve said Dispatch Saturdays. A note at the bottom said duplicates for training, reportedly returned after audit, do not discard. The dates matched a period locals still referenced with nervous jokes, which meant details might still identify private people. She logged the box in a generic way, using the Lakeshore District and a wide date range to protect identities. She told herself it would wait until Monday, then she found herself winding a reel on the library machine. The machine clicked softly, and a voice filled the tiny playback room, thin and metallic. The first tape was a ranger briefing about posted signs and seasonal closures, and nothing seemed strange at first hearing. A man listed wind patterns, then a woman read names for volunteer cleanups, and then someone said maintenance reported missing bolts on the north dock. The voice added that the bolts were not stripped, they were removed carefully without damaging the boards. A second tape included a dispatcher answering calls about diesel sheen near the old boat ramp. According to the label, fishermen reported a smell like hot plastic, and a teenager reported chain rattling under the planks after dark. The dispatcher kept people calm while advising them to stick to lit areas and avoid the roped section. Rena paused the machine and wrote notes in her spiral, keeping each line factual with times and initials. She checked the storage log for incident reports from those dates, and the log showed vague entries about routine patrol and no injuries. It seemed like a cluster of small maintenance problems, which did not explain the careful script on the warning sleeves. She switched reels, and a new voice took over, quieter and closer to the microphone. The label said Saturdays 2, with a date from 1991 in shaky handwriting and a stamped number. The voice mentioned archived calls about chain noises again, and added that footprints led down the roped section in soft silt. Someone in the room asked about weather, and the answer was light wind, clear night, no boats scheduled after sunset. The voice then read a memo that asked rangers to log all interactions with a particular vendor near the snack stand. It said, do not escalate, document demeanor, and confirm hours against posted permits, using a separate clipboard. Rena recognized the clipboard instruction style, which matched old county risk templates for potential liability tracking. Vendors generated paperwork when things went sideways, especially near open water with kids, which made steady documentation crucial later. Still, the tapes kept circling the same triangle of dock bolts, chain noises, and the roped section. She printed a map from the binder with blank labels, then drew a tidy triangle between the dock, the snack stand, and the ranger tower. The map helped her visualize lines of sight, and she started marking places with little asterisks for maintenance incidents. The roped section sat slightly east, hidden from the snack stand by cottonwoods, which mattered for visibility. Another reel played a clipped exchange where a ranger told dispatch that a gate lock appeared new and unregistered. The ranger added that cones were moved and a laminated warning sign had clean nail holes without rust. The dispatcher asked for photos, and the answer was already taken and copied for the folder labeled permits. The next tape changed tone with a shaky breath before an officer started reading notes into the recorder deliberately. He said witnesses reported a loud splash near midnight, then a truck engine idling on the far turnout. He said tracks showed heavy tread, then lighter footsteps heading back alone, and a partial plate was recorded without certainty. Rena stopped and checked the case index, trying to locate an incident number referencing a midnight splash during that month. The index only showed a maintenance order for replacing stolen chain and a request for more reflective tape. She underlined the lack of a matching incident and added a small arrow to her running list for later verification. On Tuesday morning, she asked her supervisor if she could inventory the box more thoroughly since the reels were fragile. He nodded without interest, telling her to log whatever needed logging and to shove the box behind tax rolls. That gave her private time in the playback room, which she used to build a timeline on fresh paper. She listened to another Saturday tape where a woman from the tower called dispatch about a boat drifting across the boundary. The boat moved lazily, but the line drifted toward the roped section, which was posted as no entry. The woman sounded firm, and she logged the time. Then she asked for a ranger with a bullhorn. A tiny clink echoed on the tape before a second voice said, "Hold on," then added that a chain was loosened again. The tower watched two shapes bending by the boundary floats, and the dispatcher repeated the request for immediate response. Sirens filtered faintly through the recorder. Then the tape ended with an abrupt click that did not feel accidental. Rena checked the log again and found only a note about routine lake closure with citation for boundary violation. She highlighted the citation number and scribbled a request to pull the paper copy from the offsite cabinet. If the citation sheet had officer notes, she might find names replaced with initials and a vendor detail. In the afternoon, the intern returned with coffee, and Rena asked if he knew the lake from hiking around. He said his cousins called it the turnaround because teens used the far turnout to swap drivers late at night. He said people heard the chain in the wind and joked that it meant a shift change for the lake. She asked about the vendor by the snack stand, and he shrugged, saying an older guy sold bait from a cooler. He added that the man kept to himself and that the stand closed after 2003 when bathrooms needed repair. Rena thanked him, then went back to the machine, because one more reel had Ranger Tower 2 in heavy ink. The reel opened with playful teasing about coffee. Then a woman said the boundary floats were drifting again toward the shallow shelf. She made a note that the vendor stayed late, counting cash, and that 3 pickup trucks idled by the turnout. She said wind from the ridge pushed small waves against the dock posts, and the sound carried. Then came a gentle thud, and the woman said quietly that bolt heads were missing again on the north ladder. She asked anyone nearby to bring a camera and mentioned small shavings near the posts, like metal caught and ground shiny. She said it looked new, not weathered, and suggested logging it as tampering after checking permits. Rena wrote ladder bolt heads missing and circled the phrase carefully, then drew a line to the earlier chain note. She felt the outline of something organized, not merely bad luck, and the tapes added a pattern of late Saturdays. She felt a pinch of frustration because the official paper trail looked deliberately harmless compared to the recordings. She filed a request to review tower logs that year, and the clerk gave her a battered binder with loose pages. The tower logs used pencil, and the Saturday pages looked smudged, but several entries repeated a vendor name pattern. The pattern matched the earlier instruction to log demeanor and hours, which meant quiet escalation without confrontation. An evening tape from 2001 began with static. Then the dispatcher said the tower line would record summaries every hour. The tower voice read weather, then listed vehicles, then paused at a truck with a partially obscured plate covered by dust. The tower added that the truck bed held a heavy chain coiled flat and the ends taped tight. Rena felt the air in the room go thin, though she knew she was just listening to old caution collected for audits. The tower voice kept going, steady and calm, calling out 2 sets of footsteps and 1 pair returning alone toward the turnout. Then the tower said the vendor appeared nervous, closing early and locking a cooler with a new padlock. Another reel documented a ranger walking the roped section at dawn, taking photos of raw scrapes on chain links. The ranger said the scrapes were bright, not dull, and the boundary floats had new gouges near the welded rings. He guessed someone had dragged the chain to the shelf, making deep channels beside the ladder posts. She studied the map again, measuring distances with the edge of a note card and aligning the triangle to the shoreline. The shelf sat where the cold current ran channel to channel, sucking down loose gear and stunned fish every spring. If someone knew that flow, they could use it to hide things quickly, maybe even move something heavy without splashing. The county maintained a box of anonymous tips from that period, and Rena requested the file through the clerk quietly. The tips mentioned fights in the turnout, and a truck with fresh dents, and late-night cash counting by the stand. One tip described a crying woman near the chain in 1991, then wrote, "He told her to get in now." Rena breathed slowly and kept her notes clinical, because she was not a detective and the tapes were not a case file. She wrote potential domestic dispute near boundary, then wrote check for missing persons in overlapping county dates. She cross-referenced the years against a public list of unresolved reports, without printing names or addresses. Within that public list, several families had posted memorial pages that mentioned the lake vaguely without pinning a location. The dates brushed the Saturday span, and at least one message thanked volunteers who had searched old drainage channels. Rena did not draw conclusions, but she felt the box had been kept near the window for a reason. The thickest reel contained a training segment that sounded like a quiet warning wrapped as procedure. A supervisor read instructions for dock inspections, then emphasized that bolts should be numbered and painted once installed. He said repeated substitutions by outside contractors had caused confusion, then urged rangers to photograph every ladder each week. He read slowly, reminding staff to check chain markings and to log any bright scrapes within 24 hours. He asked that vendor interactions stay cordial but detailed, and that cash counts should match posted hour sheets precisely. He repeated that night closures had reasons, and that the roped section protected a shelf known for unpredictable suction. The tape ended with a short statement that felt heavier than a standard sign-off, even to someone outside enforcement work. The supervisor said the lake keeps receipts, and he called tape steel a kind of ledger if you knew how to read. He then asked that all summaries be placed in the Saturday binder, followed by a written note in the permit folder. Rena returned the reels to their sleeves, then updated the entry in the inventory system with a quiet summary. She wrote that the contents included dispatch summaries, tower logs, and training instructions, and that these might interest risk management. She flagged the box for restricted copying and added a line suggesting improved storage due to evidentiary value. That night, she drove to the lake and parked by the official overlook, staying within the open hours like a normal visitor. The water looked glossy and harmless, and a steady breeze shoved new leaves across the shore in rattling waves. Families packed up coolers, while a ranger checked the rope line and reset a slack float with a practiced tug. She walked the path between the tower and the snack stand, then down to the dock where the ladder bolts gleamed. They were painted red, and small numbers were stamped into the heads, which suggested a new practice after the tapes. A sign near the rope read "No entry, shelf unstable," and the letters were bold without clutter. A man in a lake crew shirt saw her taking photos and asked if she needed anything, and she said just admiring. He nodded and said they had redone the hardware, then added that the chain had been upgraded to a heavier gauge. He pointed out a new anchor a few yards deeper where the current used to pull and said it cost plenty. She asked if the improvements followed a particular incident, and he smiled without offering details, then looked toward the tower. He said the lake gets busier every year, and they prefer keeping rules friendly and simple to help everyone. He wished her a good evening and kept walking, tapping each cleat along the dock with a small hammer. At her desk the next morning, she wrote one final paragraph for the internal memo, careful with every single word. She explained that the tapes documented a pattern of weekend tampering around a hazardous shelf with persistent chain disturbances. She wrote that witnesses described idling trucks and partial plates, and that tower logs flagged a vendor for careful tracking. She recommended digitizing the reels, then filing them with risk management as potential warnings that improved current safety practices. She attached her timeline and map using initials and generic labels to avoid identifying anyone who might still live nearby. She kept her tone neutral because the point was preservation, not drama, and the tapes already carried weight Before sealing the memo, she added a small line that explained how the tapes worked like a quiet lighthouse. They glowed in the dark of back rooms, keeping watch over a place that looked relaxed but demanded attention. They did not accuse anyone directly, but they pointed toward the triangle where the water kept its swift accounting. She delivered the memo to her supervisor, who skimmed it, then set it aside for the weekly folder without comment. He asked if the reels were labeled securely, and she said yes, and he nodded and said, "Good, thank you." The box returned to the shelf, but the entry now carried a bright strip indicating restricted handling under department guidance. A week later, risk management requested digital transfers, citing an internal review of seasonal safety procedures for public areas. They noted that the dock hardware had improved and that the chain layout matched new engineering reports after recent surveys. They asked for any additional recordings from surrounding years to complete their context for training material. Rena stayed out of that conversation because her role stopped at preservation, though she felt a calm sense of completion. The Saturday binder had finally spoken in full sentences, and everything pointed toward the same quiet conclusion. The tapes were a warning written in small sounds that added up to a clear map of careful harm. When she finally visited her sister that weekend, the stew tasted warm, and the apartment felt crowded with plants. She described none of the lake details, only saying she liked hearing old voices explain rules that still mattered today. Her sister laughed and said she had always loved rule followers because they were the ones who kept doors from sticking. In the months that followed, the dock signs stayed bright, the chain stayed tight, and the roped section kept its distance. Families watched sunsets without wandering across the floats, while rangers checked the ladder bolts and stamped numbers. A new plaque near the overlook said thank you to volunteers for years of safe seasons without naming anyone specifically. People told stories anyway, because lakes attract stories, and most were harmless and not entirely accurate. Rena preferred the tapes because they never chased drama, and they always returned to measured facts. They cared about footprints on silt and bright scrapes on metal and the way a current can tell time. If someone asked her privately why a box of tapes mattered, she offered a simple answer without personal detail. The lake taught the staff to listen for small patterns, and the tapes taught the staff to write them down. Warnings are not always loud, and sometimes they arrive as quiet instructions that keep strangers safe. She thought of the supervisor who said the lake keeps receipts, and she believed him without needing a name or headline. The water gave back bolts and shavings and slack rope, and the staff learned to read that ledger patiently. In that way, the old Saturday voices kept working, guiding hands without demanding attention or applause. By the next summer, the tower logged more visitors and fewer citations, and the vendor stand sold cold drinks, not bait. The chain still hummed on windy nights, but people heard it as a plain boundary, not a rumor. The tapes stayed in climate storage, digitized and labeled, a warning preserved as training rather than tragedy. When the county finally archived the memo with the transfer receipts, Rena slid a copy into her personal binder. She liked the neatness of an ending that did not demand a dramatic reveal, only patient steps that matched evidence. The lake did not need a ghost, it needed attention, and those tapes had asked for it many years ago. She drove by the overlook after work one evening, watching the sun burn down into a clean line on the water. A ranger tapped the cleats again, just like before, and the chain lay tight and bright across the current. The triangle she drew on paper felt like a familiar shape in her mind, precise and ordinary, and finally understood. The rest stop camera footage from Highway 93. Travelers who stopped along Highway 93 inches northwest Montana still mention a brief clip that circulated for a week. The footage reportedly showed a man walking out of frame near midnight while snow shifted across the empty lot. A sedan idled by the bathrooms and never moved again before dawn touched the pines. No one claimed ownership of the clip, and investigators never confirmed the original source or the download path. The image quality invited arguments rather than conclusions, and the winter air did nothing to settle them. The nearest town was Polson, and the rest stop sat above the lake on a rise that caught hard weather. State records describe the area as a recurring trouble point for visibility and minor collisions during early winter storms. The site had 2 cameras that faced the lot and a third that covered the vending alcove by the map board. Archived notes indicate the equipment came from a basic highway contract that rotated vendors every few years without fanfare. None of the paperwork settled where the clip first appeared, and none identified a technician who signed for backups. Some locals claimed a short video floated through a closed group chat used by road crews. The night in question was the second Friday of early December of 2019, according to dispatch logs from Lake County. Snow had begun by late afternoon, and the wind stacked it against the curbs in ridged lines. Plows ran the main lanes before midnight and left a narrow path through the lot for anyone who needed a break. A power blink left the building lights off for several minutes, and then the generator caught and held steady. The logs show a trooper performed a pass-through at 2320 and saw nothing worth marking on the form. The same logs show no calls from the payphone that evening despite the outage. 3 people can be placed there with enough confidence to matter without reaching beyond the available record. The first was Adam Riley, aged 39, a freight driver moving appliance boxes toward Kalispell for a morning offload. He pulled in for coffee and a quick look at his straps, then sat in the cab while the heater fought the cold. The second was Claire Dominguez, aged 32, a biology graduate from Missoula, who drove north to meet a supervisor in Whitefish. She used the restroom and texted a roommate who later saved a screenshot for the county file from 2009. The third was Mark Ellison, aged 50, a state maintenance foreman traveling between stockyards to inspect salt sheds after the first storm. He reported iced hinges on a service gate and left a note inside the supply closet for the morning shift. Accounts diverge when the sedan appears in the frame because the angle creates a small blind spot on the driver door. Riley told a deputy that he saw taillights glow brighter twice, which suggested the driver shifted between gears without moving. That detail appears in state records and survives multiple retellings, even though no mechanical issue was later confirmed. Dominguez only recalled the idling sound and a figure by the map board who stood with hands in pockets against the wall. Ellison wrote in a maintenance message that a dark vehicle parked near the trash cans and never rolled forward to the pump. The logs show no pump on site, which means the line refers to the air hose near the curb. The footage itself begins at 23:38 based on a faded timestamp that never received formal validation from anyone. A figure moves from the vending alcove to the passenger side of the sedan with a slow step that never changes pace. Several frames flicker, and the camera catches snow streaks that cross the lens like scratches pulled from film. The figure leans toward the window, then steps away without opening the door and drifts toward the lot exit without lifting a hand. Headlights from a southbound pickup wash the scene for a second, and the figure is gone from the edge of the frame. The sedan continues to idle, and the clip ends without a clear reason for the cutoff. Investigators never confirmed who downloaded the clip or how it left the original storage cabinet inside the utility room. The vendor at the time maintained a small metal box with a lock that technicians opened during scheduled rotation dates. Archived notes describe a misplaced key during late autumn and a temporary latch that could be nudged with a thin blade. The technician who signed for December maintenance reportedly transferred in January and left no forwarding contact beyond a business mailbox. None of this establishes a leak or a deliberate removal, yet the timing continues to bother the county planner. Records conflict on whether the box was inspected before the storm cycle gained momentum. The sedan belonged to an adjunct instructor from Dillon who had borrowed the car from a colleague for a weekend trip. State records confirm the plate and the title while leaving the route vague between Missoula and the reservation boundary. The instructor, aged 42, taught evening classes and managed 2 short shifts at a bookstore to cover early winter bills. She was reportedly traveling to Columbia Falls to help a relative close a seasonal cabin before the deep freezes returned. A receipt from a bakery in Arley places her on the highway after dark with a bag of bread on the passenger seat. That bag appears in a still frame when the headlights glance across the interior during the flicker. Search efforts began the following morning when a wrecker driver reported the sedan idling without a driver and without hazard lights. A deputy arrived first, according to dispatch logs, and found footprints blown over by streaking snow that erased depth. The doors were locked and the keys sat in the center console with a phone buried under a cloth grocery bag. The trunk was empty and the glove box held registration papers and a folded map with a circle around Olney. Dogs brought to the scene struggled with drift lines and veered toward the tree line where wind piled snow into shoulders. Some locals claimed the scent pulled west toward the highway margin before breaking apart near the culvert. Investigators requested broader camera pulls from nearby businesses and workyards that face the corridor between the lake and the pass. Several owners cooperated and offered clips that showed plows and a few pickups and a tanker that turned north before midnight. None of the video showed the instructor on foot, and none revealed a second figure near the sedan during the crucial minutes. Records conflict on whether a white compact parked beyond the main lot for a short interval that might matter. An early report mentions a brief shape near the broken fence where Ellison noted the iced hinges on his form. That note sits in the county file from 2009 because older case folders absorbed later cases for space. In the weeks that followed, the rest stop became a point on a map inside a small conference room in Polson. State records show volunteers checked ditches and borrow pits along Highway 93 from Jet to Rollins during the first clear days. A local pilot offered a slow pass along the lakeshore and reported nothing visible among the shards of ice near the reeds. Troopers returned at night to test reflections and shadow lines across the lot and compared them with the clip in question. They tried to stage a match with a volunteer who wore a wool coat and moved with the same slow step. The camera never produced the same blur, and the lighting refused to line up with the timestamp. A year later, a storm knocked power again, and the generator failed to start, which forced a temporary closure of the site. During that shutdown, workers replaced cables and found a second card wedged behind a plate that covered the main recorder. The card held partial files that opened badly and stopped before the important sequence began, which frustrated the deputy who carried them. A subcontract report states that earlier models sometimes created ghost indexes when power returned after momentary loss. The vendor suggested the card represented a half-written table and not a deliberate swap by anyone with a goal. Investigators never confirmed that explanation, and the working group chose not to issue a statement. Riley kept driving that corridor for another season and later told a reporter that the clip looked cleaner than the original screen. He believed that someone had trimmed noise, which would require access to software and knowledge that he did not possess. Dominguez finished her degree and left the state, though she kept a copy of the screenshot that showed the time. She said the clock on her phone did not match the timestamp, which raised a small question that no one answered. Ellison retired after the following winter and still maintains that a second vehicle idled near the trash cans for a moment. Investigators never confirmed any vehicle beyond the sedan that appears in the known frames. The instructor's family held a private service in Missoula during early spring of 2020 and kept attention away from the site. They worked with a mediator to settle loan questions and a quiet transfer of the borrowed car back to its owner. State records do not reveal friction between parties, and no civil filings came through the courthouse on Main Street. A single notice asked for information regarding the clip and offered a contact that later expired without follow-through. Some locals claimed a new video surfaced 2 winters later and showed the same figure walking at the edge of the lot. Investigators never confirmed the existence of a second clip and warned against reading too much into blurry frames. The rest stop today looks unchanged to passing drivers who slow on the grade and lean toward the lake when wind rises. The vending alcove still holds a faded map with thumbtack holes near the park boundary and an outdated campground icon. A new lock sits on the utility room, and a paper log hangs from a nail where technicians sign in pencil. Dispatch logs still mark minor collisions and a few stranded motorists when the plows fall behind at shift changes. Travelers step out for a minute and talk about the cold that climbs under sleeves before it settles in bones. The lot records what it can, while the cameras blink against snow that moves like static toward the edge of memory. The stories. This dispatcher flagged a warning nobody else heard. In the summer of 2015, a small county dispatch center in the Midwest logged what should have been another quiet night routine: calls, minor accidents, nothing serious. But at 2:36 a.m., dispatcher Lorna Keats flagged a single line in the call log with a red warning tag. The rest of the shift didn't notice. 12 hours later, a missing person report came in from the same road. Lorna was 52, a mother of three, and one of the few veteran dispatchers still working nights. She'd spent more than 20 years listening to the county breathe through static. Drunk drivers, runaway teens, distant gunshots that usually turned out to be fireworks. That night, she was scheduled to train a new hire, Evan Rhodes, a quiet 20-something fresh out of community college. He remembered her as calm, methodical someone who double-checked even the quiet calls. The call in question lasted just 19 seconds. It came from an unregistered prepaid cell phone traced to the stretch of County Route 47 between mile markers 19 and 20. The caller didn't say much, just a breathy male voice repeating, "He's still here," before the line cut. Background noise? Steady hum, maybe an engine, maybe wind? Lorna replayed the audio 3 times, then filed it under possible domestic disturbance. But something made her stop the recording and reopen it. According to her later statement, she heard a faint ticking sound under the voice mechanical, uneven. Like a turn signal that never clicked off, she said. At 2:38, she added a note, "Warning possible vehicle hazard, County 47. No one responded. The patrol car assigned to that region had already been rerouted to a stranded motorist 15 miles away. The shift ended at 6, and by the next day, the flag was buried beneath dozens of other overnight notes. 2 days later, a farmer found a truck half submerged in a drainage ditch along the same stretch of road. Inside was 30-year-old Bradley Norham, a construction worker from a nearby town. Engine still idling, phone missing, seatbelt unlatched. Coroner placed the time of death around 2:40 that same morning, within minutes of Lorna's flagged call. County investigators wrote it up as a single-vehicle accident. They said Bradley likely swerved to avoid a deer, hit the embankment, and drowned before he could escape. Lorna, however, couldn't let it go. She'd handled too many wrecks to ignore the timing. The ticking sound, the phrase, "he's still here," the untraceable number, it didn't add up. A week later, she retrieved the audio from archive storage and took it home on a thumb drive. Her husband found her replaying it that evening, headphones pressed tight, not speaking for almost an hour. She said she thought she heard 2 different voices, one layered under the main one. A whisper, or maybe a radio echo, she told him. He dismissed it as interference, but Lorna wasn't satisfied. She called the phone company listed in the report, Westridge Cellular, to ask about prepaid tower logs. The representative told her the call had pinged off a repeater near Old Mill Road, 2 miles east of the crash. Problem was, that tower had been offline for maintenance between midnight and 3 a.m. She double-checked through county records. The outage was confirmed. If that was true, the call shouldn't have connected at all. When she brought this to her supervisor, he told her it wasn't her concern. "The system hiccups sometimes," he said. "Let it go." Instead, she filed a quiet memo through the internal server detailing her findings and sent a copy to a friend in the State Highway Patrol. The friend, Officer Miriam Cole, kept the note, but admitted later she didn't think much of it until months afterward. Then, in November of that year, a storm knocked out power across the same district. During the outage, technicians discovered a repeater box still running from an auxiliary generator, a model decommissioned years earlier. Inside it was a burned SIM card fused into the port. Serial number partially visible, it matched the first digits of the untraceable phone from Lorna's warning. This detail never made the official report. A small internal inquiry followed, but concluded there was no functional link between the repeater malfunction and any known incident. By that point, Lorna had already transferred to a day shift. She told coworkers she didn't want to hear the night anymore. Years later, a regional journalist researching abandoned communication systems stumbled on the archived memo. The journalist, Alan Marin, interviewed Lorna at her kitchen table in 2020. By then, she'd retired and moved to a smaller town near the river. In the recording, which he later shared for a local podcast, she said something quietly that caught his attention. "You know what gets me?" he said. "He's still here." Not, "I'm still here." Someone else was supposed to hear it. Alan followed the breadcrumb trail dispatch logs, weather reports, the crash file, and that malfunctioning repeater. He found that the generator inside had been serviced twice after its supposed decommission date, each time by a subcontractor called Northspan Utilities. Northspan had folded in 2013, 2 years before the incident. Whoever maintained that repeater after the shutdown wasn't listed in county records. Allen managed to contact one former Northspan technician, a man named Dennis Harlow. Dennis said that in the early 2000s, some repeaters were used to piggyback maintenance frequencies for nearby rail lines. It was a cheap way to test emergency signals, he said, but it was never supposed to overlap with civilian channels. If it did, you'd get bleed-through, like ghost calls. Ghost calls. That term caught traction online when Allen's podcast aired, though Lorna hated it. She said the word ghost turned it into superstition, not signal bleed, not malfunction. Still, she admitted the possibility haunted her. The crash site, the voice, the timestamp, they lined up too neatly. In 2021, the county repaved Route 47, covering the drainage ditch. The wreckage was long removed, but for maintenance training, new dispatchers were still shown the red-flagged log from that night as a case study in procedural diligence. The warning nobody else heard became a quiet legend among the staff, half cautionary tale, half proof of how easily small details slip away. What remained were fragments: the 19-second clip archived under a generic file name, the memo Lorna wrote, the service invoices from Northspan, and the coroner's note listing water in the lungs. Each on its own could mean nothing. Together, they formed a pattern too odd to ignore but too thin to prove. Lorna passed away in 2023. At her retirement gathering the year before, a few old colleagues brought up the story. She just smiled and said, "It was probably static." Then, according to Evan, her trainee from that night, she added quietly, "But static comes from somewhere." At this point, the facts that remained were simple. One call, one warning, one man dead on a dark county road. The system logged everything perfectly except for the truth behind that 19-second window. Whether it was interference, a misrouted test frequency, or something else, no one could ever show exactly who made that call or why it stopped where it did. Still, in the dispatch training manual filed a few years later, there's a footnote beside Lorna's case study. It reads, "Always listen twice before you clear a line." No capital letters, no bold text, just quiet advice embedded between procedural codes. A reminder that sometimes the sound we dismiss as noise might be the only signal that matters. The stories. Paramedic who kept one final snapshot. The story began with a photo that shouldn't have existed. A single Polaroid, slightly overexposed, showing the inside of an ambulance during a call that supposedly never happened. It was discovered years later, tucked between the pages of an old medical manual in a small-town fire station's archive. The man behind that photo was Martin Kessler, a 42-year-old paramedic who'd spent nearly 2 decades working in a quiet coastal county. He was the kind of person people trusted instantly: steady hands, calm voice, always first on scene and last to leave. Colleagues said he never forgot a face, even from calls years earlier. That photographic memory made the irony of what happened next impossible to ignore. In late March of 2012, Martin and his partner, Dana Ruiz, responded to a dispatch from a stretch of highway north of town. A rollover accident, single vehicle, one driver, reportedly conscious but trapped. The log shows they arrived at 2:17 a.m. Weather clear, visibility decent. Everything about the report was ordinary. Until it wasn't. When firefighters reached the car, there was no one inside. Seatbelt unbuckled, airbags deployed, engine still ticking from heat, no footprints in the gravel shoulder, no sign of struggle. Dana's field notes mention Martin standing there longer than anyone, staring into the dark beyond the guardrail, as if waiting for something to move. He didn't say much on the drive back, just, "It doesn't feel right. Someone was here." The next morning, Martin called the dispatcher, asking for the driver's name. There wasn't one. The system had registered the call as civilian report unknown source. No, 911 record existed, only a radio relay from a patrol unit that later denied making it. That was when Martin started keeping a notebook part medical log, part journal. He filled it with incident details that didn't make sense, addresses that didn't appear on maps, names that changed between shift reports, an emergency call from a decommissioned nursing home that had burned down 5 years earlier. Dana joked it was his ghost file, but Martin treated it like evidence. In mid-April, station archives show him requesting a portable camera from inventory, the kind still used for accident documentation. He said he wanted backups for reports. No one questioned it. That camera became the source of the one photo that remains. On May 5th, Martin responded alone to a cardiac distress call in a residential neighborhood. The official dispatch recorded a woman named Eleanor Marsh, age 71. When Dana arrived 15 minutes later, the house was empty. No patient, no signs of struggle. Only Martin, sitting on the front steps, shaking. He told her he'd just finished chest compressions, but there was no body. That evening, he turned in a sealed envelope to the station chief. Inside, a single Polaroid showing an elderly woman on a stretcher inside the ambulance. Her face pale but peaceful, IV line in her arm, heart monitor reading a steady rhythm. The timestamp on the photo matched the call, yet no hospital in the region logged a patient by that name, and the ambulance's GPS data placed it in the station lot at the time. For weeks, the department treated it as a data glitch, a wrong timestamp, maybe a mistaken upload. Martin, however, stopped taking calls entirely. He used his accumulated leave and disappeared from the rotation. Dana later said he'd started visiting the county records office, spending hours looking through missing persons reports from the 1990s onward. According to the clerk's statement, he requested files on one case repeatedly, a local woman, 71 years old, who'd vanished from her home in May of 1996. Her name, Eleanor Marsh. She'd been last seen the same week a younger Martin had begun his EMT training in that same county. What tied them together came from an old photograph Martin found in the file. It showed a group of EMT trainees standing beside a vintage ambulance. On the far left, a younger Martin smiling awkwardly. On the far right, a woman in a white nurse's uniform, Eleanor, back when she'd volunteered with the training program. Her sudden disappearance had never been solved. The case quietly closed after 3 years. The evidence stacking grew stranger. In late May, an internal audit found Martin had accessed archived radio frequencies from the old dispatch system equipment retired in 1999. He'd been trying to trace the source of that first mysterious accident call. Logs showed someone or something still transmitting on that outdated frequency once every few nights, always repeating the same brief phrase, "medic en route." By early June, Martin returned to work briefly, though he looked exhausted, his once steady hands trembling. He told Dana he thought the woman from the Polaroid had been trying to reach him for years, that all the phantom calls were echoes of old emergencies, looping through time until someone finally answered. She begged him to take time off again, but he refused. "If I stop listening," he said, "they'll stop trying to come home." The last confirmed sighting of Martin Kessler was on June 15th of that year. Surveillance footage from a rural gas station shows him fueling the ambulance alone, headlights off, before driving north toward the old highway. The timestamp reads 2:17 a.m., the exact minute of the original rollover call. 3 days later, the ambulance was found parked beside a defunct rest stop, keys still in the ignition. The driver's side door was open, the radio turned to static. In the back compartment, responders discovered a single Polaroid camera lying on the gurney. It contained one undeveloped sheet of film. That image was later processed by the state lab. It showed the inside of the ambulance, empty except for a stretcher, with 2 folded paramedic jackets placed neatly side by side. The back doors stood open, facing a foggy stretch of road. The official report labeled Martin Kessler missing, presumed deceased. No further transmissions were logged from the old frequency. The firehouse quietly retired his call sign, and the Polaroid was sealed in evidence storage, tagged simply, "Recovered from Unit 7, June 15, 2012. Years later, when new recruits asked about him, veterans would point to the framed photo on the wall, the one of Martin and Dana receiving their service award in 2010. Behind the glass, barely visible under the reflection of overhead lights, there's a faint double exposure. The outline of an ambulance interior, doors open, a stretcher waiting. At this point, the facts that remained were simple. The snapshot was real, the patient never existed, and somewhere along that forgotten highway, a paramedic might have finally answered a call meant only for him. The stories. Night guard who logged footsteps, no camera recorded. The night it happened, the security office at the old Westmore shipping depot smelled like dust and burnt coffee. According to shift logs, a 42-year-old guard named Dennis Halbrook clocked in at 11:30 p.m. and wrote a short note. Asterisk. Routine patrol. Clear floor. Humid tonight. Asterisk. He was the only guard on duty. By dawn, his chair was empty, his flashlight was lying under the main stairwell, and the building's cameras, 8 of them, showed nothing from the hours between midnight and 2. Westmore had been a Rust Belt landmark since the late 1970s, a concrete maze of loading bays and silent conveyor belts on the edge of a quiet Midwestern town. Dennis had worked there for 7 years, divorced, reliable, usually quiet. The kind of man who showed up early and read old paperbacks during breaks. That night was supposed to be uneventful, just a standard walkthrough before the building was scheduled for renovation. Around 12:10, he logged a line in the duty notebook kept beside the monitor screens. Asterisk. Footsteps on mezzanine catwalk, West Wing. Checked cams, no feed, asterisk, a minute later, asterisk, still hearing it, will inspect, asterisk, that was the last thing he ever wrote. The plant's internal system backed up video every 6 hours. When investigators reviewed the footage from the mezzanine camera, the feed cut to static precisely at 12:08. Other cameras kept recording fine until 2:30, showing only flickering lights and empty halls. A maintenance worker named Harold Cortez arrived early that morning to replace fluorescent tubes on the ground level. He found Dennis's flashlight lying on its side, beam still weakly glowing, and the notebook open. No sign of struggle, no torn fabric, no blood. Just footprints, 2 sets tracked faintly through the dust. One set from Dennis's standard issue boots, the other, smaller, bare, leading to the freight elevator that hadn't worked in months. The county sheriff's department filed the case as a missing person. Official notes cited malfunctioning surveillance and probable equipment interference. But people who'd worked there doubted the malfunction explanation. Westmore's night tech, a woman named Carla Wynn, swore she'd serviced those cameras the previous week. They were old, but fine, she told local reporters. The cables were intact. You can't lose a feed that clean unless someone cuts power at the board. Dennis's sister, a nurse named Ruth, said he'd called her the night before. He'd sounded distracted, mentioning he'd found a second badge lying by the locker room door. She assumed he meant another guard's ID, but the company only issued one active credential, his. Archived building logs later showed the same badge used twice that night, once when Dennis clocked in, again at 12:11, opening the West Wing stairwell door. Whoever used it the second time moved toward the mezzanine exactly where Dennis had gone to investigate. By late summer of 2014, the company shut down the depot and cleared out the interior. Cleanup crews unearthed a small personal cassette recorder near a ventilation shaft behind the third bay. It contained about 30 seconds of audio, the hum of lights, a pair of quick footsteps, a metallic clank, then Dennis's voice saying, "Who's up there?" followed by a short distortion burst and silence. Audio engineers confirmed the tape had been magnetically warped, likely by exposure to a strong field, not heat or age. There was another strange detail buried in the sheriff's supplementary report, a mention of radio interference in patrol channels between 12 and 12:30. The on-call dispatcher logged fragments of words bleeding through static asterisk. Northgate, lights out, he's still here. Asterisk, none of the other guards were on duty that night, and the next scheduled patrol wasn't until morning. Years later, a local journalist named Owen Ralston revisited the case for a regional history program. He interviewed former employees and found that in 1998, 2 decades earlier, another guard, 39-year-old Gerald Pike, had disappeared during overnight maintenance. Same mezzanine, same missing camera footage, same unexplained power surge. Back then, the report blamed faulty wiring. Ralston tracked down Gerald's surviving son, who showed him an old Polaroid his father had taken before the disappearance. The photo captured the West Wing catwalk at night, lights flickering in the distance. In the lower right corner, partially blurred, was a faint silhouette that seemed to be looking down at whoever held the camera. Analysts couldn't verify whether it was a reflection or a person. But when the journalist compared the layout of that image with modern floor plans, he noticed something: the angle matched exactly where Dennis's flashlight was later found. What made it worse, the timestamp written in blue ink on the Polaroid's border, asterisk, the 3rd of April 1998, 12:11 a. M asterisk was identical to the digital record of Dennis's badge swipe, asterisk 12:11 a. M asterisk, two men, 16 years apart, logged in the same minute of the hour, in the same corridor, just before both vanished. Electrical engineers consulted during Ralston's project suggested a pattern of ground faults that might have caused rolling blackouts localized to one wing, possibly scrambling old analog video circuits. It could explain the synchronized failures, but they couldn't explain how both guards' ID logs and physical traces pointed to motion beyond any camera's field. In late autumn of 2021, the depot site was finally demolished. Before the demolition, a volunteer archivist named Leah Torres cataloged remaining items from the security office for the county museum. Inside a rusted filing cabinet, she found the original duty notebook sealed in a plastic evidence bag. Most pages were smudged, but the last line stood clear under the dried ink. Asterisk. Still hearing it. Will inspect. Asterisk. Beneath it, barely visible under a tilt of light, another faint line appeared, impressed by pen pressure, not ink. Forensic enhancement later revealed, asterisk, recording this time. Asterisk. That phrase matched an unfiled cassette found near Dennis's locker years earlier, the same type used for the warped tape. The archivist played it carefully on a restored deck. The audio was faint, but at the 13-second mark came what experts described as a pattern of steps, counted 7, then stop. The acoustics placed it roughly 10 feet above the ground, consistent with the mezzanine. When news of the find resurfaced, Ralston added an epilogue to his documentary. He pointed out that both the 1998 and 2014 incidents shared one quiet constant. The security logs always mentioned footsteps, but never the echo that should have followed in a steel-floored building. He speculated that the mezzanine's partial collapse during construction years earlier created a space that resonated oddly, bending sound in ways the old analog recorders couldn't track. Maybe, he said in the closing narration, what Dennis heard wasn't someone walking, but the building replaying itself. The official record lists Dennis Halbrook as missing, presumed deceased. No remains were ever found. The West Wing mezzanine was melted down with the rest of the metal. Today, the old depot grounds are a parking lot for long-haul trucks. Drivers who park overnight sometimes mention hearing boots pacing above the asphalt when the wind picks up, though there's nothing there, just open sky. Local radio traffic still gets random interference near mile marker 32, short bursts that resemble a steady rhythm of footsteps. At this point, the facts that remained were simple. 2 guards, years apart, logged the same minute, heard the same sound, and left no image behind. The rest, whatever it was, stayed between the missing frames of a camera that never recorded and a notebook line that never should have been there.